Katherine Paterson is the award-winning author of Bridge to Terabithia and over 40 other books.
When I started, I had to write on the dining room table. That was the only place I had to write. And then I'd have to clean it up for the next meal.
Vermont Edition host Mikaela Lefrak talks with Paterson about her life, legacy, and writing at her home in Montpelier, Vermont.
I truly love this world, and I'm not eager to leave it.
You have lived so many places in your life, beginning in China. You were born in China. Your father was a Presbyterian minister there. And then when you moved back, you lived in a number of different towns in Virginia and West Virginia and North Carolina. What was the first place that you remember thinking of as home?
Well, Huang Fu. I was there till I was 5. And my parents, missionaries have a very bad name, but my parents were different, shall we say. And so we lived in a Chinese house, and we lived on a compound because my father was asked to be principal of a boys' school. So he found property where he could have the school, and everybody who lived there was Chinese, except us. And because I was the middle of 5, and I had 2 baby sisters very quickly, I would wander over to Mrs. Liu's house, who was the Bible woman, and she was a widow, and I have lunch with her every day because it was guaranteed to be Chinese food at her house, and it wasn't always guaranteed to be Chinese food at my house. So I was very much at home there.
Did you grow up speaking Mandarin?
I was bilingual, and my mother used to get very annoyed because we'd never speak Chinese to foreigners. She wanted us to show off our Chinese, my older brother and sister and I. And we never would because we knew that wasn't appropriate. And I found a letter that my father had written to his mother, and I was not 2 years old. It was the summer before I turned 2 in October, saying, I don't remember the other children talking this much. And the Chinese don't remember it either. So apparently I couldn't be shut up in either language. So don't try to shut me up today, Mikaela.
Never. I read somewhere that you tried to return to China as an adult and weren't able to. You wanted to teach and be a missionary and went to Japan instead.
Yes.
Why weren't you able to re-enter China at that time?
Well, it was the communists were not letting anybody in who had any kind of religious label. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll go to Taiwan, and for other reasons I did not. And I had a friend who was Japanese. And of course I hated the Japanese because of the war, because we'd been bombed and then we'd been occupied, and the Japanese soldiers were very scary to me.
And that's why you had to leave China when you were young.
That's why we had to leave China, of course. And I said, if you'd give the Japanese people a chance, I think you might feel differently. And I thought, well, I love you, so yeah. And it was really absolutely wonderful 4 years. And I really expected to spend the rest of my life there. And then I met John Paterson,
that guy.
changed my plans.
How did you two meet?
Well, Mikaela, he came. I had gotten a scholarship to Union Seminary in New York City, and so I was there for my leave year from Japan. And he was in a tiny church in Western New York, and they had a program for ministers who'd been out in the field, and so he came for that program. And he and one of the other guys, the last night they were there, were looking for somebody to play bridge with, and so somebody sent them over to our apartment, and I didn't play bridge, but two of my apartment mates did. So, but it was like that advertisement of the guy comes through the door and your roommate meets him at the door, and while you're getting dressed in the other room, and and so I met the young men at the door while my roommates were getting all primped for these two young ministers. And I couldn't tell this to the general public.
Oh, you must now.
It's a bad example, but he said, "Don't you?" He said, "Wouldn't you like to play?" I said, "I don't know how to play. I've got to go study." And he said, "Wouldn't you like to learn?" I said, "No." Well, anyhow, so the telephone rang the next morning, and of course I was the first one up. You know, I'm miserable. I always did my homework. I was always the first one up. I'm not that bad anymore. So it was John Paterson that I barely met the night before. And I thought he wanted to speak to one of my apartment mates, but no, he wanted to speak to me. And he said, "Would you have lunch with me today?" I thought, okay, I mean, why not? And after lunch, he said, "Would you have time for a walk?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." So I really cannot remember what he said, but I realized he was going to marry me. And he began, the first letter I got from him was from the airport, February the 28th. I saw him several times, and we got married July the 14th.
Wow, fast.
And, it worked out pretty well.
Sure did.
It's much more complicated story than that, but that's the bare bones.
You two got married in 1961.
62.
62, excuse me. And went on to have 4 kids together. And after you became a mother is when you started to write.
Yeah.
And I'm so curious to hear what it was like in those early years trying to build a career as a writer, or to, put together your first manuscript and send it off to an agent or an editor. I'm not sure how you went about that. And what it felt like to do that while also being in a traditional marriage, raising young kids, right as the sort of feminist revolution was happening. Was that a movement you identified with, or did it feel very separate?
I didn't have time to think about having a revolution. Believe me. I really began. I had a professor in seminary before I went to Japan, and she stopped me in the hall one day, and she said, "Katherine, have you ever thought about being a writer?" And I've been a reader since I was 3 or 4 years old, and I love being a reader. But I knew what good literature was. And I said to Dr. Little, I said, I wouldn't want to add another mediocre writer to the world. And she said, she was my seminary professor, she said, maybe that's what God is calling you to be. And I couldn't believe God wanted any more mediocre writers. So I went to Japan, and she actually got me my first writing job.
What was it?
I wrote a book called Who Am I for 5th and 6th graders about the Christian faith. Good propaganda. Seriously.
Yeah.
I mean, propaganda has a bad name, but all it is this is what I believe in. I'd like to share it.
Yeah.
And So then I thought, well, I'm not going to go back to school teaching with 4 little kids. I'll be a writer. So 7 years later.
That's how long it took to write and publish your first book or your first novel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And and that was, you can call it luck or you can call it providence. I tend to go with providence, but this lady in the church knew that I had writing ambitions, and so she said, let's go to the Montgomery County adult program at night, and they're doing a writing program.
This was in Maryland, where you were living at the time.
So I thought, Mom's night out, So we went, and I thought, because I am the way I am, I wrote something every week, and I eventually published one short story that I wrote during that program, and the little magazine that published it died the next month. And then I sold one poem, and the little magazine that bought that died before it published the poem. and then I thought, well, if I can do a story a week, I can do a chapter a week. And I started writing my first novel. And then when I got it done, I went to the library to see who published books that I liked. And they kept saying, the whole thing is crazy. It was a novel set in 12th century Japan. And if I'd known anything about publishing, I'd known that nobody would buy that. They wouldn't think American young people would want a book about 12th century Japan. But
in a way, you were writing what you knew. You had lived there. You had studied the
what I knew
culture.
And what I cared about.
Yeah.
And the young woman who, in those days, some of the publishers had what they call slush piles. And I've seen the slush piles in my day. It's just, they're shelves, row after row after row after row of manuscripts that have come in without an agent or without anyone to recommend them. And in those days, sometimes people read those things. And so I tried several places, and just happened it came to this publisher, and the young woman who had to read it took it to the senior editor. And the senior editor had just come back from Japan, loved Japan.
There you go.
And published it. Still in print.
And then you were off to the races.
And I was given to Virginia Buckley, who was just coming off of maternity leave, and therefore had nothing on her desk. And Virginia and I worked together for 40 years.
Oh. It's a special partnership.
Absolutely. You would not be interviewing me today if it were not Virginia Buckley. Wonderful, wonderful editor. And people think editors tell you what to do. She would never tell me what to do. She would just ask me the question.
Yeah.
And make me solve the problem. That's real editing.
Well, whatever you were doing with her produced some magic. Between 1975 and 1980, you won 2 National Book Awards and 2 Newbery Medals. That's also the period in which you published your most well-known novel, Bridge to Terabithia. What was that period like for you? How did those awards and that recognition change your life?
Well, after I won the Newbery for Bridge to Terabithia, I met the first Newbery winner that I'd ever met. And she said to me, "You know what comes with the medal, don't you?" And I said, "No." She said, "A divorce."
Congratulations, Katherine.
but it didn't, fortunately. But the hardest book to write was Jacob, because I'd won, by the time, while I was working on Jacob, I won Reached Terabithia Newberry. I won honor, Newberry Honor for Gilly and the National Book Award, and I won the National Book Award for Master Puppeteer. And I thought, this book doesn't have a chance. And I thought, I'll send it to Virginia with a fake name on it, and if she thinks it's worth publishing, then it'll be okay. So I was a long time writing the book. It took it was almost 3 years, I guess. And Virginia said, just called me one day, and she said, "Are you working on anything?" And I said, "Yeah, but I don't know if it's any good." And she said, "Just promise me you won't send it to me under a pseudonym." People always ask me which is my favorite book, and I don't really have a favorite, but by gum, Jacob, who I loved, is the one I'm proudest of, because I thought I could never get that book done. And I did, and I'm really very proud of it.
Could we go back to that comment that other Newbery Award winner made to you about what comes with an award is a divorce? I wonder about that, because it's a funny story, but also I've been curious if that level of success and the time you were devoting to writing, if that caused any strain in your relationship, especially at this time when it wasn't typical in the way it is today for women to be working as much as men.
Yeah, and you're never supposed to make more money than your husband. Or be better known than your husband.
Yeah.
I've often said that John Patterson was the only man in my generation that would have stayed married to me, because all my friends who really achieved something did get a divorce. And a lot of them, Newbery winners, got divorces. Because it was very hard for the man in this situation. And I know it was hard for John, but he he stayed there.
He knew he was lucky.
He stayed there with me.
You and John and your family moved to Barrie in the mid-1980s after living in Maryland for many years near Washington, D.C. How'd you feel about moving?
Well, when we went to Norfolk for 8 years. And
in between the two?
Yeah.
Okay.
And Norfolk, when John was called to Norfolk, I said, "John, you do not want to go south." And he said, "I've lived in the South." I said, "No, you have not lived in the South. Tacoma Park, Washington is not the South." And of course, we had John integrated our church in Tacoma Park. And, it became integrated when he was
while
pastor.
he was there.
And a couple of people even left the church over that. He's a Connecticut Yankee, and he just said, "I lived in the South. I know what the South is like." And it was very difficult in many ways, because both of our daughters are of color, and at the time, my older daughter had an African-American boyfriend who came to see him, and that caused a stir, of course. And
both of your daughters are of color?
They're both adopted. The girls are both adopted. Our older daughter's Chinese, and our younger daughter's half Apache and half Kiowa. And
so you were worried for them moving to the South at that time?
Yeah. Well, it was hard for them.
Yeah.
So when after 8 years, and there were many good things, and I had friends there that I cherished. That my whole life was living in a place long enough to have friends I couldn't bear to leave, and then leaving them. So when John was thinking about coming to Vermont, I said, "Okay, one more move."
Well, here we are 40 years later in your Vermont living room. You stuck to that. I'm just struck by how varied the places are that you've lived. Mm-hmm. And it must have been a real mentality shift to move to a place like Barre, Vermont, from living in the South, both in, I mean, not technically Tacoma Park, but, in the D.C. area, and then moving to Norfolk, Virginia, which is certainly the South. Do you remember what it was like to move there and to try to meet people and make friends?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It was so different from the South. And because if somebody moves in the South, you run over with the pie.
No one brought you a pie?
No. And I mean, I'm sorry, but New England seemed very cold to me. And John would say, "Oh, but South, everybody's just so slushy," and I said, "I need a little smudge and slush."
It was nice.
And besides, I remember one afternoon, I thought, "Oh, my heavens, it's time to start supper. It's dusk." And I rushed downstairs and started getting supper ready. And I looked at the kitchen clock, and it was 3 o'clock.
3:30, yeah.
Oh, mercy.
How did you meet friends? How'd you make friends? I think it's a thing. It's something many of us struggled with.
It is so hard, and especially if your kids are all growing up and
right.
going. And I remember in Norfolk, of course, after leaving my dearest friend in Maryland behind, and I had a whole lot of friends there because there were so many writer friends there, I would just be so lonely. And somebody asked me to make a talk at the library, one of the big libraries. And so I did. And in the question and answer time, there was a young woman at the back who was asking the most intelligent questions that I'd ever gotten from somebody. I thought, this is somebody very interesting. And so afterwards, I went up to her to thank her, and her name is Catherine Morton. She's still one of my dear friends to this day. Mm. And I was with her when her child died. So, I mean, we have that kind of a friendship.
Yeah. That
she wanted me to be with her when her child died. And so then I had to leave, and I married Lee Settle, who was a wonderful adult novelist, and I had lunch together every week. And that was another friendship, that I had to leave behind, come up here. No friends! And everybody's kind of shy about trying to make friends with the minister's wife.
Who's won a couple Newbery medals, too. I would be intimidated.
So Grace Green moved here the same summer we moved, and they lived not too far away. So I guess Grace was probably my first friend here. I had met her when she lived in Massachusetts because she was a librarian, and by this time I was talking to a lot of librarians, and so Grace and Dan and John and I would begin having this picnic in our yard, 1 year in their yard, and invite all the children's writers and illustrators in the area. Mm. And we had wonderful times. And Nancy says that's where I first met her. I don't really remember, but we've had lunch almost every Wednesday since.
So I'm still stuck on this like moment in your life when you moved here with your husband, and you'd had all of this personal success with your children's literature, and then moved to a small town in Vermont. Was there where you didn't know anybody? Was there ever a point where you were like, we got to get out of here? I want to leave.
No.
Why not?
We were in the most loving church I've ever been in. I've been in churches all my life. And John was so happy. And because Norfolk had been difficult in many ways. And here was a church where people were so open-hearted. And as opposed to outside where I felt a sort of chilliness. The church was well worth the move. And in fact, when John retired, I said to the session, John knows we're supposed to move, make way for the new minister, and he's perfectly willing to do that. But I'm not. And so if you'll let us stay, we will try to behave ourselves. Well, of course, they don't want the retired minister telling the new minister how to do things. So
it kind of seems like, as somebody who you've moved so many times in your life, but it seems like the church has been a way for you to find home in every place that you've lived.
Yeah. And I like having writer friends.
Yeah. There's a lot of writers in Vermont.
Because we know, we kind of understand each other's situations in ways that people who don't write often think that it's easy and you never have any doubts or problems. But those who've been through the trenches know better.
They know. One of the books I wanted to ask you about was Bread and Roses too.
Yeah.
It's about the 1912 textile mill strike in Lawrence, Mass, and the children of workers who were sent to live with foster families in Barrie during the strike. I'm curious how you researched that in your own community and in a place where you had lived, how you got to know that side of Barrie. Like, did you meet people who had family members who had been through something like that?
Well, I'm not one of these people who knows, has so many ideas for books that they'll never live long enough to write them.
Somehow I doubt that.
I've finished a book and I think, well, that was a good career while it lasted.
How many books have you written? Like 40?
Well,
a lot.
A lot. I used to say over 30, and my agent said, Katherine, you're going to have to say over 40. And I said, I haven't written more than 40 books. And she said, would you mind going to your website and counting?
And you're like, oh.
But anyhow, I was, I was between books. And I was, at that time, the Vermont area history thing was on the top floor of the Aldrich Library. And I was just wandering around there, and I saw that picture of the kids on the porch of the labor hall. And I thought, there's a story in there. And so Karen Lane was the librarian at the time and knows as much about Vermont history as anybody in the world. And so I began asking her about it. And so she put me on some things. And there's the old Bering newspapers. There was a lot of information in them. There wasn't as much information on the strike as you would expect. And I really had to dig for that. After or about the same time my book was published, was a very good nonfiction book on the strike, and which would have helped me immensely, but I didn't have it at the time. But I really loved writing that book because of course, you had to get into the history of the time, and the bravery of those people just absolutely astounded me. And it was the women, it was the women who were the brave ones in that. And of course, they sang when they marched. And somebody has said, you cannot defeat a singing protest. And I think, well, that's how the civil rights protest. My husband was jailed during he went south to march and was jailed, and they were put into one cell, and they couldn't even lie down in the cell. They were just jammed together, and they just sang all night, ran the jails crazy. But there's just something about people singing that's very powerful.
Do you like to sing? Do you like to sing?
I used to. Pretty good. And now I have no high and I have no low. So I try not to sing too loud. Old age takes a lot of stuff from you.
Well, if you don't mind, I would love to talk about old age a bit.
Sure.
Because we're in this period in our culture right now where we are very interested in longevity and kind of figuring out how to live forever. That seems like one of the focuses of many of our tech billionaires right now is how can I beat death? How can I slow aging? And a lot of money and a lot of time is going towards that. I feel like there's a new TV show and podcast every day coming up on how to live forever, how to exercise or eat to change your fate. You're 93 now. You seem to have figured out something that these tech billionaires have not.
Well, I love this world. I truly love this world, and I'm not eager to leave it. But there comes a time when you have to move out. And not overcrowd the universe. There's also one thing about old age, like not being able to sing as well as I could sing pretty well. That's pretty much gone. My hearing which used to be very good, even with hearing aids, is imperfect. My sight, which, I've been a reader all my life, it's harder for me to read because my eyes aren't as strong as they were. So the losses begin. And then I was thinking the other day, finally you've lost enough things that you realize that you're ready to go. I'm not quite there yet. And I kept saying, I don't want to die before Margaret and Nick get married. And
are they your grandkids?
Yeah. The younger of the daughters, and I love Nick. And Margaret would, Nick hung around for Margaret forever, and Margaret would go off and find herself or find a new job or Margaret.
Well, maybe she knew you were waiting around for that. She said, if I put this off, Nana will live forever.
Well, they finally got married. And so the day they wanted me to marry them, actually. So that's another long story I won't get into, but I did. I didn't say that I now pronounce you because I refused to pay the $40. I'm too Presbyterian. So her Quaker father paid the $40 so he could do it. But we took all these pictures at the church, and I've been standing up for 45 minutes, and as you can see, I'm old and creaky. And so I said, when they said, well, let's go down to the lake, because I got married in Lake George, let's go down to the lake and take more. I said, I think I'll just go back to the house and rest, because I wanted to go to dinner afterwards. And so I was lying on my bed, and my son John opened the door, and there I am lying on the bed. And he said, Mom! I said, I'm not asleep. I'm just resting. So, oh, thank God. Because everybody was sure that I wanted to live long enough for Margaret and Nick to get married. Now they're married. So
get out of here.
And I've been working on this book. And so Mary, my youngest, she said, well, what's the situation? I said, well, we've sent everything to London that we can send right now. She said, you don't think that means you can die, do you? I said, no, I'd like to hang around a little longer.
Right, good.
Maybe see it published or something. I pray that I'll be happy and ready to go when the time comes. But right now, just a little more time, please.
Well,
not forever. Not forever. I do not want to live forever, and I do not want to live past the time where I can enjoy life and enjoy the people I love and my friends, and and every day there are new things to make life interesting and enjoyable.
Well, you have been you've thought so much about death and grief throughout your life, have experienced it yourself, have supported people like your friend who you mentioned when her child died. You saw your son lose his best friend when he was a little boy, which was the basis for your best-known novel, Bridge to Terabithia. And I wonder if you see a connection there between looking death in the eye. Oh, you had cancer too when you were a younger mother. Is there a connection for you between having to look death in the eye, seeing what death and grief are like, including for people who are young, for whom they're not ready to go, and how you feel now about it? This what seems like a really healthy acceptance and also joy in your older years.
I don't know, Mikaela. I just had such a good life. I can't imagine anybody who's had a better life than I've had. And so I guess I'm just very grateful for it. And I've tried to do, all the estate stuff, all those things, so that when the day comes, there won't be, as I say, I want my children sad but not mad. Because it's very hard if things aren't taken care of. And so I think I'll start getting rid of things so they won't have so much stuff to deal with when I go, because I will go. And I'm afraid my children are not very accepting of the fact that I will go. I mean, I'm 93, for heaven's sakes, and that's a lot longer than a lot of people live, especially.
There's this really great book about death and grief I know called Bridge to Terabithia. Maybe you could suggest they read that.
I probably shouldn't tell you this, but Bridge to Terabithia sells more than all my other books put together. And I thought, not too long ago, I guess it was last year, I wonder what there is about that book that makes it sell year after year after year. So I thought, I better read it. Now, I read it. I thought, well, it's a good book. I thought, I better read Kelly Hopkins. I thought, that's a better book than Bridge to Terabithia. I thought, I better read Jacob. I read Jacob. I thought, good, better, best. Me, who's literary critic, after years looking at what I've written.
Huh.
So it's kind of fun.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I just think I'm just talking objectively about literature, not about theme or anything like that. I just think it was better written.
But why do you think Bridge to Terabithia has had such staying power? It has its 50th anniversary. Its 50th birthday is next year.
I know. I want to live long enough.
Yeah, you gotta stay around for that one.
The day it celebrates its 50th. I think there's something about it that has made people bring their own grief to it. Which is why I don't want children to read it when they're not emotionally ready for it, no matter how well they read. And I can't be the judge of that. I think parents and teachers are much better judge. You have to know the child. I've had this rather marvelous experience lately, which has gone on over many years. And I got a letter from a 16-year-old, and this was 10 years ago, back in 2 pages, single space typed. And she said that she had to write to me to thank me for what Bridge to Terabithia had meant to her when she was 9. And she said that, growing up, her parents had painted her bedroom pink, and she hated it. And she hated pink. And she knew there was something wrong with her, that she was different somehow and weird. And then she read Bridge to Terabithia, and the girl was doing boy things and the boy was doing girl things. And she thought it was all right for me to be different. And she, at the end of it, she said, you probably didn't want to read all this from about a book you wrote 40 years ago from a weird kid, or a queer kid in California, but I just had to tell you this. Well, I've treasured that letter. I wrote back to her and I said, her name was Amethyst McKay. I said, Amethyst, you're the dream reader for every writer, the one who takes the book and makes it her own. And I guess I got one more letter from her after that. And then that was it. And so I'm doing this book of essays, and I wanted to use that letter, but it'd been 10 years since I heard from her, and I thought, I don't know what her situation is. And so I began to track her down. And I actually found a phone number for her. And I called, and it was an answering machine. Said, "This is Cam, leave a message." And so I said, who I was, and that I'd gotten this letter from her 10 years ago, and I wanted to use it in a book of essays, but I felt I couldn't without her permission. And I had hardly hung up when the phone rang, and it was Cam, who is now Cam. And we had the most wonderful conversation. And she said, "Of course you can use my letter. I'd be honored, and you can use my name. I'm Cam now, but I was Amethyst then." I mean, it was just unbelievable. So I shared that with my agent who's helping me with this book, bless her heart. And she said, that should be a whole chapter of its own, because this whole book is about how important readers are to writers. And that's the most wonderful example of what happens to a book when it's given to the reader. And so I sent the essay to Cam, and she said, "I know it's hard for somebody your age, but I've been they since I was 16. And I said, "We can do that." And she said, "Of course, when we first started, I was Amethyst, and sorry for you to be Amethyst, but I appreciate your saying Cam now."
Yeah. Is that for a book you're working on now?
That's the book I'm working on now. Because, people always say, what's the best thing about being a writer? And it's the readers.
Yeah.
Somebody that takes your book and makes it their own.
And that's what you identified as first, since you were a little girl.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
When is that book coming out?
27. In conjunction with the 50th anniversary of guess what? So I have to live that
They
long,
know what they're
don't I?
doing over there at that publishing house. I read somewhere that you always either wrote by hand or on your typewriter. Is that still the case?
No. I used to do everything by hand. And I've had, how many operations? And I thought, Jane Austen didn't have carpal tunnel. Charles Dickens didn't have carpal tunnel. They wrote much longer books than I did. But it was suggested that I switch. I compose on the computer now, but I don't like it because it makes things look too perfect. And when you're on the first draft, you have to know you're making trash. Otherwise you're too satisfied with something that's no good. So I switch to handwriting when I get stuck because, it's kind of a good process.
Yeah.
Right from here to here.
Right.
And I would prefer to do that, but I'm old. Now I have a fake elbow.
What?
So it's hard to touch type.
You're bionic.
I'm bionic. I've got a rod up my leg, screws across my ankle. I've got a fake elbow and a fake tip to my elbow. I'm a wreck.
Far from it. Last question for you. Where do you like to write? Where do you sit? Do you have a special place you like to write?
There, yeah. when I started, I had to write on the dining room table. That's the only place I had to write. And then I'd have to clean it up for the next meal. And then I guess when we moved to Maryland, I had a big desk in what was technically the guest room. And so that was nice because I had a desk with drawers and I was more private and I didn't have to move things all the time.
Yeah.
And then in Norfolk, the only place I had was the front porch. It was a sort of a louvered porch, but it was boiling hot in the summer and freezing in the cold weather. So each of the kids had a bedroom. And so when they started going off to college, I said, how long do I have to keep these rooms as memorials to the dear departed? And John said, well, if I get into Dartmouth, you can have my room. And Mary said, no, you can't. I get her room. You can have my bedroom, which was small.
Poor Mom.
So I had the small bedroom. And here I have a study. And Barry, I had, we bought a big house, so I would have a study. So, in my latter years, had more space.
Yeah.
But process, people say, and I think, I have written around interruptions all my life. And in order to, very often, the only thing to do is to get up before anybody else was up. And also before my boss was up, my boss being my self-critic that kept saying, what makes you think you can be a writer? So one of my essays on how to be a good boss, because if you have a bad boss, it makes your one employee is very unhappy and will not do good work.
They'll report you. Thank you so much for hosting us in your home.
Well,
it's been a real honor.
Well, thank you very much.